Hi guys, how's it going? This is part two of my videos about the On You Sound record label. I'd left off on the first video, mentioned how in 1983 Adrian Sherwood, his good friend Prince Farai, had been shot dead in Jamaica, and because of that, the label in the first few years was real heavy into the reggae sound. But because of that, he kind of lost his motivation to keep making all these dub reggae records. And although he still put stuff out under Dub Syndicate and African Head Charge, his direction changed a little bit, and one of the major contributors to the new sort of the change in the sound and his new focus and the more heavy, I guess heavy sound, more rockish, more industrial, was a guy named Mark Stewart, who had been the singer of the pop group. And Stewart had heard some of the early hip-hop stuff coming out of New York. The band The Pop Group was a fairly famous post-punk band, and they'd gone to New York and played New York City, some of the different clubs there, the Mud Club, things like that, playing experimental music. But he'd heard some of the, on the radio shows there, some of the like the early hip-hop mixes and stuff, and was really intrigued by some of the hard-hitting drumming and stuff, and the early like programmed drums. So he came to Sherwood and said, you know, I want to make some music with the kind of that feel, the hard-hitting drums, but I want you to twist it all up and make it weird. And it happens that Sherwood, around this point, he'd been in New York. One of the early Dub Syndicate albums he'd put out through the U.S. label ROIR, Reach Out International, I think it is, which at the time was only putting stuff out on cassette. But the guy from that label said, hey, you should hook up with Tom Silverman of Tommy Boy Records and do something with him. He seems like he'd be a good guy for you to work with. And so he got together with Tom Silverman and put out this album, I guess it's a single by kind of a girl singer group called Akabu, called Watch Yourself. And yeah, just kind of a one-off thing. But through Tom Silverman at Tommy Boy, he met the drummer Keith LeBlanc, who had been with Sugar Hill Records, part of their house band, and just put out a single called No Sellout.
Distinguished guests, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, friends and enemies. Malcolm X. No sellout. Malcolm X. No sellout. White, black, brown, red, yellow. Doesn't make any difference what color you are.
So anyway, he brings Keith LeBlanc to the UK with him, and they record a track, and they keep in touch. And the next time Keith comes back, he brings his bandmates, the guitarist Skip McDonald and the bassist Doug Wimbish, and they start putting down tracks backing Mark Stewart. So I can't remember which is the first Mark Stewart album to feature. The first Mark Stewart album on the label on On You Sound actually is backed by kind of the reggae musicians, like Dub Syndicate type guys. The second one, this might be it, I can't remember, is backed by the those guys, the Sugar Hill band guys. Yeah, it's kind of takes a while to get used to. It's he liked his stuff mixed really kind of rough and his vocals distorted. Sometimes he'd sound like he's down the hall. Sometimes he'd sound like he's like, you know, singing through a megaphone. Sometimes it sounded like it was recorded just overloaded, like the levels are way blown. Takes a little while to get used to. It's not the real clean recording style that you're typically used to with, like, say, rock music. And so they released some of the stuff under Mark Stewart and Mafia. pretty interesting stuff. Probably not the first place to start with the On You Sound label, but definitely sort of bringing in the post-punk or punk ethos to it, and kind of an early sort of industrial sound, which would influence a lot of people later on. So the guys that played for Sugar Hill Records kind of created their name there. They'd recorded some stuff with Tommy Boy, did some session work. When they came to England, they set up a label with Adrian Sherwood called World Records, and they started putting out stuff under the name Fats Comet. So here you've got Stormy Weather. These are all like 12-inch singles. Bop Bop.
The big sound coming your way. The big sound coming your way.
On the B-side, Zoop Zoop. And don't forget that beat.
Maybe some good would really use your difference. I expect to get what I asked for.
I got a message for you.
Hey!
And so these are real heavy, kind of stripped down, bare bones, funky kind of rhythm things with samples and fuzzed out guitar coming in and out. Really weird stuff. I think it was described somewhere as like, you know, Funkadelic had progressed on their sound in the 80s and kind of took on some of the hip-hop influences and things like that. Maybe they'd sound like Fats Comet. I'm not sure I agree with that assessment, but yeah, some pretty cool stuff. And then they started recording. That was kind of their more experimental stuff, but they started recording some more kind of rocked out, kind of more rock-oriented stuff under the name Tackhead. And that's kind of the name they're more generally known as, Tackhead. So this is What's My Mission Now? then they started recording some stuff with a guy named Gary Clail. He'd been a friend of Mark Stewart's. He was, I guess, a scaffolder, kind of like a working class guy. But he'd show up at some of the On You Sound shows and would kind of like MC, or he'd kind of be like the hype man. And so they started recording some stuff in that kind of that spirit where they laid down the Tackhead guys will lay down the rhythm, guitar, and stuff like that, and then he'd do his vocal stuff over top. So you've got Hard Left. A lot of times it's sort of political themes, reality, Half Cut for Confidence. While they were recording some of these tracks, Keith LeBlanc at night would, I guess, and the other Tackhead guys, they'd spend the night time in the studio when they had time. Especially Keith, it was kind of his project. Putting together, taking the rhythm tracks and twisting them around and mixing them up strange, and eventually it came out as this album called Major Malfunction.
Liftoff from the 25th space shuttle mission, and it is clearing the tower.
Up 3 engines now to 104%. Challenger, go with throttle up. Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
But we've never lost an astronaut in flight.
Completion of the roll program and throttle down and engine throttle back to 104%. At that point we had an apparent explosion.
No communication. No explanation.
Heaven on earth. Ain't no heaven on earth nowhere. 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 Nowhere.
Really a landmark album as far as early kind of programmed drum beats and sampling. I think not really samples, but I think everything on his done through like tape splices and things like that. All the found sounds and sort of narration. There's some recordings of the guys from NASA. The theme of the album kind of comes from the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. And so the title Major Malfunction actually comes from the NASA guys talking like they're watching what's going on. They're saying obviously there's a major malfunction. But really, really cool stuff. Definitely have an excellent album. Another one from Keith LeBlanc, his follow-up album Stranger Than Fiction.
Einstein has made the universe.
Or a single off that album, Einstein. You see this around stores. I think this was distributed in the U.S. through Network, so a little more common to find. And so the Gary Clail stuff, those singles, they put out an album on You Sound, or actually on Network, the Network label, at least in the U.S., called Gary Clail's Tackhead Sound System. So kind of recreating the sound of him at the shows with the Tackhead rhythm tracks, and Adrian Sherwood kind of mixing everything up and tweaking it, and Gary Clail doing his vocal stuff over top. So in a way, kind of a compilation of the tracks off those Tackhead 12 inches, but different mixes on things. This one I used to see a lot, obviously here in the U.S. In record stores. Not so much lately, but this was pretty widely put out and distributed, so you'll probably see this around fairly often.
It's Tackhead tape time.
Kicking heavy metal-ass cunt-sucking bored bastards.
Even your wortmost desires go down on this record, even your most filthiest dreams.
But definitely worth picking up for $10 or less. But the guys, they tried to kind of turn Tackhead into a rock band, a legitimate rock band, and eventually picked up a singer named Bernard Fowler, a great singer. He was part of the New York Peach Boys, toured with Herbie Hancock when he did like the Future Shock album. They went on tour. He was the vocalist. Great vocalist, but it never quite worked out right. So a couple of the later official Tackhead albums, Friendly as a Hand Grenade and Strange Things, not quite as good, I don't think, as the earlier stuff, the 12 inches and all, but here's a remix 12 inch from, I think this is from the Friendly as a Hand Grenade album, called Demolition House, and on the B-side, Ticking Time Bomb. And here's actually the 12 inch for Ticking Time Bomb. Still pretty good stuff. If you see them in the dollar bin, definitely worth picking up. Speaking of Gary Clail, along the same lines, kind of recreating the same thing where Adrian Sherwood do kind of a live show using tapes of the rhythm tracks he'd recorded, stuff he was working on in the studio, and mixing it up live. And Gary Clail doing his live vocal stuff, kind of his MC, hype man type stuff over the top. So this is sort of a studio version of that whole feel, the sound system experience. So there's tracks from like Dub Syndicate, Barmy Army, which I'll show in a minute. Some of the stuff he was working on at the studio at the moment, Tackhead, things like that. And these are kind of like remix tracks of that. This is another one I used to see in record stores all the time, but not so much lately, but definitely worth picking up for like $10 or less if you see it.
This one's called Two Thieves in a Liar. Don't seem to get in the area.
I've had a few dealings in the city, met a number of stockbrokers, and I can tell you, in all my life, I've never seen such dishonesty and greed. It's like a big betting shop, a bookies, a casino, where they're all screwing each other and the rest of the world.
Barmy Army in the area, from the forthcoming album, It's an English Disease, featuring a man called Star Slot Bubbler, and from the mighty Tackhead, Skip McDonald. It's one big body, no one's taking a back. One big body, no one's taking a back. They want to privatize the air.
And later on, they released, I don't know, there's probably 4 or 5 Gary Clail albums under his own name. And sometime in the early 90s, I think. He kind of somehow got big on the rave scene. I think he cut a track called Beef, and there was some interesting remixes of it. And so a deal was cut with Perfecto Records, which I think Paul Oakenfield was involved with, kind of the DJ. This is the whole like rave era. And so some singles were put out. This one called Escape, and then another one I got in the same sleeve, Human Nature. But kind of interesting stuff mixed up for the whole dance scene, a little more electronic, things like that. You know, if you see these in the dollar bin, they're worth picking up. They're not essentials. But, yeah, and then Barmy Army, really interesting kind of one-off album. Wasn't a band or anything, it's just a project. Yeah, he takes kind of like all the musicians from the On You Sound stable of people he worked with, and lay down some really weird tracks. And then he brings in a lot of samples of crowds. You can see the cover. It's you know, you got a soccer, the English would call it football game going on, but it's kind of a take. There's, I think, an album by a scientist, something about the World Cup. So I think it's a play on that. But there's a lot of samples of crowd chants and songs they sing at the football games, soccer games there in Europe. And references to different players. I'm not real familiar with them. Leroy, yeah. Anyway, Brian Clout. I'm not sure who these are, but it's really cool. I used to watch English football, soccer games when I was a teenager. It would come on the public television station, along with Doctor Who and things like that, and I'd watch them, and it kind of reminds me of that. The crowd chants and all that stuff, but it's a really weird mix. Some electronic, more electronic music type sounding stuff, some more rock stuff, some tracks more like dub, reggae. Really cool album, definitely worth picking up. One of their essentials, I'd say, off the label. And I should mention one of the important musicians to kind of come into the On You Sound stable of musicians here about this time in the late 80s to early 90s was a guy named David Harrow. Great keyboardist, synth player, programmer, drum programmer, rhythm guy. He'd actually been living in Berlin, doing some acting, and involved in kind of the synth music scene. Had recorded some stuff with Ann Clark, and it shows up on a record, one of my favorite Jaw Wobble records, recorded live in Amsterdam, I think, in Holland, yeah, called Without Judgment. But this guy here, David Harrow, just a brilliant keyboard player, does some really cool stuff with the synths. But yeah, a really important member of the On You Sound team. Plays on a brilliant track on here called Devo.
Devo, Devo, Devo.
Having wandered into the original crop from Alan Devonshire.
So yeah, so in more recent years, got involved with the band. I shouldn't say in recent. This is like late '90s, mid to late '90s. Got involved with a Japanese band that was into dubbed out stoner reggae called Audio Active, and did some really interesting stuff with them. And in recent years, Sherwood himself, he's put out some stuff under his own name through the couple albums through Peter Gabriel's Real World label. And recently he's worked with a guy named Pinch, who I guess is kind of like an electronic, maybe dubstep type producer. They've done some stuff in collaboration and put it out recently. And so the label has always been active since about 1980. There were a few periods where he got involved with licensing the catalog to different people, like the I think it was a German label, EFA Median, which put out all the late 90s reissues, and I think something happened with them. And then he got involved with EMI, and EMI kind of imploded, I guess, had restructuring or something, so it kind of tied up the catalog, and he couldn't promote the stuff and was having trouble getting his product out. But in recent years, they've been real active and putting out a lot of re-releasing a lot of stuff, repressing stuff on vinyl, doing box sets, doing some retrospective type things that gather up his different remixes he did off the label, which are pretty interesting, called Sherwood at the Controls. And there's also a set called Science Fiction Dance Hall Classics, curated by Trevor Jackson, I think, which came out as like a 3 LP set or a 2 CD set, which is a pretty good overview of the label itself. Probably worth picking up if you can find it for cheap. It looks like I've seen a few on eBay for, or Discogs I should say, for like less than 20 bucks for the 3 LP sets. That's pretty good. And then the label itself, I guess starting out in, I think about 91, started putting out a series of albums called Pay It All Back. And they were kind of like promotional albums. They reduced price, promoting the different stuff coming out on the label. This is the very first one. And pretty cool. It's got pictures of all the different releases from the label on the back. And so it includes stuff that had just come out on the label or was coming out soon, as well as exclusive tracks, unreleased stuff, remix versions of things. So this is actually a pretty good place to start if you want to get familiar with the label. Pay It All Back. There's volume 1 through 5. I've only got the 1 on vinyl. I've got the rest on CD. There's volume 2, 3, 4, and 5, and 6. Yeah, really cool series. A lot of exclusive remixes and unreleased tracks. Really cool stuff. Yeah, so like I said, the labels, it's become more active recently with reissuing stuff. They put out the first 4 African Head Charge albums on CD and vinyl, and I think there's a box set where you can get the first 4 albums plus another album that's like unreleased mixes and tracks called Return of the Crocodile. I know at least one of the Singers and Players albums they've reissued on vinyl recently. The Dub Syndicate stuff, for some reason they haven't reissued that on vinyl, I don't think. Or the New Age Steppers, although some of that came out like in Cherry Red or Static, some different labels outside of On You Sound, even though they were officially like On You Sound Productions. Yeah, so that's kind of a quick, hopefully quick, this probably came out to more than 30 minutes, overview of the label, and hopefully it's kind of helpful, kind of interesting. I tried to work in some sound samples as I could, some little clips, stuff that would fly under the copyright radar. I know some of the tracks I tried would you would only make them playable, the video playable in Japan, so I had to cut a lot of the stuff out. But yeah, hopefully this is kind of interesting, helpful if you're at all heard of the label or interested in the label. But yeah, I just wanted to make the video